Some cults were so disturbing, even the police refused to step inside their temples. And others were so dangerous, the FBI had to intervene before their leaders pushed their followers past the edge of reality. But here's the strange part. Almost nobody knows these stories. They're not in documentaries. They're not in the famous lists of scariest cults. And some were so unsettling, their files stayed sealed for decades. In this video, you're going to discover 5 of the most disturbing cults in human history, all real, all documented, and all sharing one thing in common. Authorities only stepped in when it was already too late. As you move through each case, you'll notice a pattern. Every cult believed they had found a truth so powerful that if it were real, it would change everything we know about faith, control, and human behavior. Let's begin, but consider this your only warning. After this video, you'll never look at the word cult the same way again. The man who would eventually call himself a living Messiah arrived in northern New Mexico long before anyone outside his secluded circle had heard the name Michael Trevessa. In public records, he remained Wayne Bent, a former radio host with a soft voice and a tendency to stare too long at those who spoke to him. But within the closed perimeter of a small property not far from Santa Fe, his followers came to believe he carried something none of them did, a presence that radiated divinity without the need for speech. The transformation of Wayne Bent into the vessel, as his earliest adherents called him, was never announced with ceremony. Those who later recounted their first encounters described a gaze that held them still, a silence that made them conscious of every breath, and a strange conviction that he understood them more deeply than anyone else had. Over time, the silence was no longer an absence of words, but a form of communication the group interpreted as spiritual authority. When he eventually declared himself the embodied Messiah, nobody claimed surprise. They had already begun treating him as one. By the late 1960s and early 70s, the group, now calling itself the Lord Our Righteousness Church, had begun purchasing land in rural New Mexico. The isolation was deliberate. Members believed the outside world, government, media, even extended family, was corrupted by spiritual decay. Living apart was not only protection, but purification. The settlement grew slowly, consisting of modest cabins, communal gardens, and meeting structures built by hand. Former members described long days of work followed by evenings in which the group sat in absolute quiet, waiting for the Messiah to speak. He rarely did. Silence became the foundation of his authority. Followers believed that divine beings had no need for ordinary language. Thus, his refusal to speak regularly was interpreted as spiritual elevation. When he raised a hand, dozens of people adjusted their positions. When he opened his eyes after meditation, believers straightened their backs. Those who attempted to leave found themselves shunned in a way that felt both cold and sacred, as though they had broken a covenant rather than a social bond. The controlling power of gestural communication grew stronger as the group's rituals evolved. Former members later spoke of nights where the Messiah would summon them individually, not through spoken instruction, but with a simple, pointed finger. They entered rooms lit dimly by oil lamps, where he would silently place their hands on his chest or rest his palm on their foreheads. Those moments were described as overwhelming, a mixture of fear, awe, and the disorienting sensation of surrendering one's sense of self. To the followers, these encounters were cleansing. To investigators, years later, they became points of legal concern. One of the most disturbing elements recorded in court documents stemmed from a ritual the group called body cleansing. Though descriptions varied, all agreed this involved physical closeness, framed as spiritual healing. Some accounts came from minors, and these statements triggered state action that would eventually reach federal attention. The Messiah insisted the ceremonies were divinely mandated and free of wrongdoing, but authorities interpreted them differently. What disturbed agents most was not just the acts themselves, but the complete submission visible in the group's behavior. Every gesture, every silence, every unspoken cue seemed to reinforce his dominance. Local law enforcement first attempted to interview members, but they were met with unwavering refusal. No one contradicted the Messiah's teachings, and no one expanded upon them either. The silence that had become doctrine turned into a shield against questioning. Officers reported that even simple inquiries, names, dates, routines, were met with blank stares or long pauses, as though followers were waiting for a signal only they could perceive. Frustration grew, and eventually the FBI began monitoring the situation, initially from a distance. Agents assigned to the case later described an atmosphere unlike any other small sect investigation they had experienced. There was no fiery preaching, no overt threats, no apocalyptic chaos. Instead, the danger lay in a quiet that felt rehearsed, almost choreographed. Documents later unsealed showed that the FBI suspected forms of psychological coercion so complete that members appeared unable to distinguish their own thoughts from the Messiah's interpretations of them. During the early 2000s, as whistleblowers emerged and allegations intensified, federal authorities coordinated with state officers in preparing an intervention. Rumors circulated within the compound that the Messiah had predicted an imminent end of days, framed not as a dramatic cosmic event, but as the moment the world would finally recognize his chosen role. Followers prepared mentally for confrontation, believing opposition was proof of prophecy. When investigators arrived, they found cabins abandoned, journals burned, and evidence hastily hidden beneath floorboards. It became clear that the group had anticipated the intrusion. What remained on the property after the intervention was a landscape of disrupted routines, unfinished meals, clothing left folded on beds, books open in the middle of pages, documents seized by authorities, some written, some merely sketched, revealed internal doctrines emphasizing bodily purity, total obedience, and the belief that physical contact with the Messiah could cleanse spiritual corruption. The writings also detailed a schedule of rituals designed to break individuality through silence. To investigators, these records formed the backbone of later legal proceedings. The trial that followed drew national attention briefly, but coverage faded quickly compared to other high-profile cult cases. This was partly because the group never embraced the theatricality of larger movements. It operated quietly, almost invisibly, and its leader projected an image of calm rather than aggression. Yet the verdict was decisive. Wayne Bent received a lengthy sentence, which he served in state custody. The compound fragmented within months. Some followers integrated back into society, others disappeared from public view entirely. Years after the disbanding, psychologists studying survivors found lingering effects tied directly to the group's silence-centered structure. Many former members struggled with decision-making, describing a sensation that choices felt unreal unless confirmed externally. Some reported difficulty interpreting facial expressions or vocal tone, after years of relying on a single man's gestures for meaning. The silence that once united the community had become an internal echo they could not escape. Perhaps the most unsettling revelation came from a set of sealed documents later approved for limited release. These detailed video and audio recordings, confiscated from the compound, fragments of routine, small gatherings, ritual moments. In many of them, the Messiah sits expressionless, while dozens of followers mirror his posture in perfect synchronization. No words are heard. The effect is eerie, even decades later, as though the silence itself were a living artifact. The story of the Samaritans of Santa Fe endures not because of explosive violence or dramatic catastrophe, but because of the opposite, a quiet, so powerful it drew people in and sealed them off from the world. It demonstrated that manipulation can thrive not only in shouted commands or fiery sermons, but in the gentle, persistent absence of speech. In the stillness of that New Mexico desert, a single man persuaded hundreds that silence was the truest voice of the divine, and that he alone could interpret its meaning. And within the federal archives that documented the group's unraveling, investigators noted a chilling pattern. Every attempt to reach the followers through conversation was met not with resistance, but with a void. That void, more than any doctrine or ritual, became the defining mark of the cult. an empty space engineered to shape belief, erase doubt, and ultimately expose how fragile the human search for meaning can become when placed in the hands of someone who speaks only through silence. Long before the word breatharian became a sensational headline, a quiet movement had already taken root in pockets of California where spiritual experimentation flourished. It began with scattered workshops, small gatherings in hillside homes, and pamphlets passed between people seeking meaning beyond conventional religion. The idea seemed harmless at first, a claim that the human body could sustain itself on prana, an invisible life force found in air and sunlight. But what started as a fringe philosophy gradually transformed into one of the most dangerous survival doctrines to emerge from the New Age era. The earliest adherents studied the writings of a woman known internationally as Jasmuin. Her statements, delivered with serene confidence, suggested that food was an optional human habit, not a requirement. She described fasting as a gateway to enlightenment, and told audiences that she herself lived primarily on light. Her claims, though widely challenged, inspired individuals in California to form their own offshoots, groups convinced they could surpass the limits of biology and break free from what they called the hunger illusion. In the quiet neighborhoods outside Los Angeles and up the coast near Santa Cruz, small circles began hosting gatherings in which participants practiced breathing routines meant to align vibrational intake. At first, these rituals resembled meditation sessions, but as devotion deepened, so did the expectations. Members were encouraged to reduce their meals, then skip days entirely, slowly working toward an ideal in which the body would learn to absorb energy directly from the environment. Leaders claimed that food was a form of spiritual pollution, a relic of a lower plane. True purity, they said, meant detaching from physical dependency. Medical records from the era later revealed the predictable consequences. Participants who attempted extreme fasting developed dehydration, organ stress, and severe malnutrition. But to the members, these symptoms were interpreted as signs of detoxification, evidence that the transformation was beginning. Leaders emphasized discipline, often praising those who could endure longer periods without nourishment. In some cases, individuals who expressed hunger were encouraged to meditate harder or were accused of lacking spiritual commitment. The California branches became increasingly insular by the late 1990s, when several retreats were organized in remote areas. These events were marketed as opportunities to experience full pranic alignment, attracting people from other states who traveled with the hope of witnessing extraordinary transformation. The retreats lasted days or weeks, during which participants were introduced to strict fasting regimens. Some arrived believing they would be taught how to transition safely. Instead, they found themselves in environments where social pressure outweighed caution. Tragedies soon followed. Coroner reports linked multiple deaths to complications from prolonged food and water deprivation. Victims were often individuals genuinely seeking enlightenment, persuaded that physical suffering was a sign they were nearing the breakthrough their leaders promised. In the aftermath of each case, group spokespeople insisted the practices were misinterpreted or improperly executed, distancing themselves from responsibility. But behind closed doors, internal documents recovered later revealed a consistent pressure to push boundaries and prove devotion through physical endurance. As deaths and disappearances accumulated, law enforcement began paying closer attention. Local authorities struggled to intervene because the movement lacked the structure of a typical cult. There were no sprawling compounds, no single charismatic figure controlling all chapters. Instead, small independent circles existed across California, loosely connected by ideology and occasional correspondence. This fluidity made oversight difficult, but the rising number of medical emergencies caught the attention of federal investigators. The FBI's involvement began quietly, triggered by a series of missing person reports that shared an unsettling pattern. Families described loved ones who had recently joined breatharian workshops, expressed a desire to evolve beyond food, and then vanished after attending fasting retreats. In several cases, The organizations hosting the retreats provided contradictory accounts of the missing individuals' final days. Some leaders claimed the participants had left voluntarily. Others insisted they had crossed into spiritual light, a phrase that investigators found vague and troubling. Agents reviewing financial records discovered another layer. The California branches had developed elaborate donation systems. Members were expected to contribute substantial funds to demonstrate commitment, often in exchange for promises of accelerated spiritual progress. Several of the groups created non-profit shells that obscured how the money flowed. Retreat fees increased over time, and leaders acquired properties in remote areas where oversight was scarce. When agents traced these financial networks, they found evidence suggesting deceptive fundraising practices that further justified federal involvement. The most alarming accounts came from survivors who eventually left the movement. Interviews conducted by psychologists and investigators revealed patterns of psychological pressure designed to sever members from conventional understanding of hunger and health. Some survivors spoke of being told that eating would reset their frequency and undo months of work. Others recalled moments of extreme vulnerability, weakness, confusion, collapses, during which leaders interpreted medical distress as a necessary trial. In one account, a woman described collapsing during a retreat, only to be surrounded by group members chanting that she was surrendering her old body. She survived only because another participant, frightened by the scene, drove her to a hospital against the group's objections. Not all stories ended in rescue. Several cases documented by coroners involved individuals found in remote areas, far from public roads, clutching notebooks filled with meditative affirmations. Investigators later concluded that these people had continued their fasting routines even after leaving group events, convinced they were on the brink of spiritual transformation. The doctrine had embedded itself so deeply that the victims internalized its most extreme expectations. Media coverage brought temporary attention to the movement, but the groups were skilled at rebranding. Leaders shifted vocabulary, renaming themselves light wellness communities or conscious nourishment circles. Retreats continued under new labels, though attendance slowly decreased as public scrutiny grew. Some adherents moved to online forums, creating digital enclaves where the ideology persisted without geographical boundaries. The FBI eventually compiled a report summarizing its findings: financial fraud, negligence, and a pattern of deceptive practices that contributed to multiple fatalities. While the decentralized structure made broad prosecution difficult, several leaders faced legal consequences tied to endangerment, unlicensed medical claims, and fundraising violations. Yet despite these interventions, the core ideology never fully vanished. It resurfaced in wellness subcultures, repackaged with new terminology, and stripped of its most extreme practices, though remnants of the original doctrine lingered in scattered communities. In retrospect, what made the Breatharian movement so dangerous was not the eccentricity of its beliefs, but the way those beliefs weaponized hope. Followers wanted transcendence, purity, and purpose. They were told that suffering was progress, and that the pain of starvation was evidence of spiritual evolution. In the end, their pursuit of enlightenment collided with the biological truth of human fragility. The promise of living on air proved fatal, and the legacy of the movement stands as a reminder of how easily the line between spiritual aspiration and deadly deception can blur. Before the House of David prophets became synonymous with tunnels and vanished followers, it began as a modest religious colony, rooted in the teachings of Benjamin Purnell. He arrived in Michigan with a calm voice, a gift for persuasion, and a message that blended apocalyptic imagery with promises of renewal. His followers called him a messenger, a restorer, a bridge to a future when the chosen would survive a destruction the rest of the world refused to see coming. What set this group apart from other prophetic movements of the early 20th century was not its doctrine, but its determination to build, quite literally, a world beneath the one it believed was doomed. The colony expanded quickly, attracting families drawn to Purnell's mixture of strict moral codes and utopian ambition. The settlement that formed around him included workshops, farms, and communal living quarters. At first, the group resembled a self-sustaining religious community, but beneath the surface, something far more unusual was taking shape. Purnell preached that the end would not descend from the sky in fire or ash, but rise from the earth itself. "The ground will open," he wrote in one sermon, "and only those who have prepared the hidden chambers of refuge will be spared." The words lingered in the minds of his followers long after he spoke them. Construction began quietly. Workers were assigned tasks that looked like routine land development, but soon the digging went deeper. Local residents reported seeing teams entering wooded areas at dawn with tools and materials, returning at dusk covered in dirt. Initially, the tunnels were small, meant for storage or sheltered prayer rooms, but within a few years, the underground layout grew elaborate. Secret chambers, narrow corridors, and reinforced caverns emerged just below the colony's visible structures. Plans retrieved later from seized archives showed a blueprint that resembled not a shelter, but an entire subterranean village. While the tunnels expanded, the colony above ground adopted increasingly rigid practices. Men were forbidden from shaving, their long beards becoming both identity markers and symbols of Samson-like strength. Women adhered to strict dress codes and rituals emphasizing purity and obedience. Daily life centered around preparation, food stores, water collection systems, and hand-built ventilation shafts connected to the deeper passageways. Members believed these preparations were acts of devotion. Adhering to the commandments ensured not only salvation but survival. Rumors of misconduct circulated outside the colony as early as the 1920s. Former members whispered about authoritarian rules, exploitative labor, and young followers who seemed to vanish without explanation. Some told stories of being led into tunnel chambers for tests of faith, emerging days later disoriented and frightened. Others reported a hierarchy within the underground system itself, with certain chambers reserved for those deemed spiritually superior. These accounts remained scattered for years, dismissed by local authorities as exaggerated tales from disgruntled defectors, but the whispers grew louder as disappearances continued. Federal attention intensified when a missing person case intersected with colony records. A young woman reported to have joined the group was never seen again. Investigators attempting to interview Purnell's followers found themselves stonewalled. Members insisted she had left voluntarily, though no evidence supported the claim. It was the first time the FBI took official notice. The agency sent observers to Michigan, documenting movements in and out of the settlement, tracking supply orders, and interviewing locals who had seen the constant stream of building materials heading toward unmarked entrances in the woods. As more testimony surfaced, a disturbing picture formed. Witnesses described hearing faint noises beneath the ground, tools striking earth, muffled conversations, footsteps echoing through hollowed corridors. Some recalled seeing children escorted into tunnel mouths during strange initiation rites. Others reported hearing rumors that certain chambers were sealed after ceremonies, though no outsider was ever allowed to confirm this. The idea that individuals could be hidden or confined underground fueled suspicions of trafficking and coercion. When investigators eventually obtained warrants to search parts of the colony, the complexity of the tunnel system astonished them. The passageways wound beneath several acres, some reinforced with timber, others carved directly into the clay and limestone. Rooms were discovered furnished with cots, lanterns, and scriptures, suggesting extended stay. One cavern large enough to hold dozens of people bore markings on its walls consistent with communal gatherings or ritual activity. Although many entrances had been collapsed intentionally, likely in anticipation of investigation, what remained was enough to confirm years of secret construction. Beyond the physical structures, records seized from the colony revealed internal writings that described a coming earthborn destruction that would begin with tremors and swallow unprepared communities. The House of David prophets believed that only those who descended into the prepared chambers would survive to witness the purified world afterward. Some documents mentioned chosen children who would be sheltered in specific underground sanctuaries, fueling concerns about the missing youth reported over the decades. Though investigators could not conclusively link every disappearance to the tunnels, the implications haunted the case files. Financial records uncovered an equally troubling pattern. Resources intended for community improvement had been diverted to fund secret excavation teams. Donations from new followers were funneled into land purchases, strategically positioned above favourable geological formations, soil that could be carved without immediate collapse. Engineers consulted years later noted that constructing tunnels of that scale without advanced equipment was dangerous and required significant manpower. The colony had such manpower. Its religious dedication ensured near unlimited labour. As federal pressure mounted, internal tensions escalated. Purnell faced civil suits accusing him of misconduct and exploitation. Some of his closest aides defected, providing testimonies that painted a portrait of a man more authoritarian than enlightened. They described rituals inside the tunnels, where Purnell positioned himself as the sole intermediary between followers and salvation. In these accounts, he promised that those who proved loyalty underground would rise as leaders in the new world after the apocalyptic event. Public scrutiny intensified when several tunnel entrances collapsed, injuring workers. Local newspapers began publishing exposés detailing the community's long history of secrecy. Although the group maintained that the tunnels were simply storage spaces or storm shelters, the scale made the explanation difficult to believe. Eventually, state and federal agencies coordinated a full investigation. Multiple properties were seized, and many tunnel sections were sealed with concrete to prevent further hazard. The colony fractured soon after, splintering into small groups who attempted to preserve the doctrine but lacked the resources to rebuild the underground network. Purnell himself died before the final legal proceedings concluded, leaving behind a legacy marked by unresolved mysteries. What remained of the House of David prophets in the decades that followed was shrouded in a mixture of folklore and forensic memory. Some residents near the former settlement spoke of hearing hollow echoes beneath the soil during construction projects. Others claimed to have stumbled upon partially collapsed chambers while hiking in the woods. Urban legends grew around the idea that deeper sections of the tunnels still existed, sealed but intact, hiding relics or remnants of rituals performed long ago. The true scale of what was built and what occurred in its depths may never be fully known. The surviving blueprints showed ambition bordering on obsession, while the testimonies revealed a community persuaded that salvation required descending into cold, dark corridors beneath the earth. It was a vision of safety inverted. Instead of looking upward for deliverance, the House of David prophets looked downward, carving pathways in anticipation of a catastrophe no one else believed would come. In the end, the apocalypse never arrived. The tunnels remained empty, silent, carrying only the stories of those who believed they were digging toward survival. The void beneath Michigan became a monument to a prophecy that never fulfilled itself, and to the followers who sacrificed their lives, labor, and in some cases their very identities, for a future that existed only in the mind of a man who convinced them the world would end from the ground up. Long after the Second World War ended, when the ideology that fueled it had been publicly condemned and globally discredited, fragments of its mythology continued to circulate in shadows. Some of those fragments merged with fringe occult beliefs, others with racial mysticism imported from Europe. What eventually formed inside parts of the United States during the 1960s was not a political movement, but a spiritual one. A clandestine circle that believed the fall of the Third Reich had only destroyed its physical form, not its astral legacy. They called themselves the Black Sun Resurrection Circle, a name whispered through underground networks of esotericism, neo-pagan revivalism, and extremist subcultures that sought meaning in the ruins of forbidden mythologies. The origins of the circle traced back to a handful of individuals who had access to post-war occult manuscripts smuggled from Germany. Among these documents were unofficial translations of texts attributed to esoteric SS groups, works that blended pseudo-archaeology, runic mysticism, and fantasies of a metaphysical Aryan past. While mainstream historians dismissed these writings as ideological propaganda, the circle treated them as scripture. They believed that hidden within them were forgotten rituals, capable of awakening what they called the eternal lineage, a spiritual force they imagined dormant since the collapse of ancient Nordic civilizations. During the mid-1960s, the group began meeting in remote parts of the Pacific Northwest. Photographs, declassified decades later, showed gatherings in dense forests, members arranged in concentric circles around fires, where symbols of the black sun, an esoteric emblem composed of 12 radial sigils, were carved into wooden altars. Attendees wore simple clothing, not uniforms, but the imagery displayed during rituals made clear the ideological foundation. The meetings were designed to appear more religious than political. Liturgical chants relied on reconstructed pre-Christian languages. Prayers invoked the rebirth of an Aryan archetype, one they believed had been suppressed by modern society. The circle maintained a strict culture of secrecy. Recruitment occurred quietly, often through heritage study groups, advertised as cultural clubs. Young men who expressed fascination with mythology, runes, or occult literature were subtly approached. Many recruits were not initially aware of the ideological direction the group would take. The first gatherings introduced them to folklore and esoteric symbolism. Only after months of involvement were they invited to deeper ceremonies and made aware of the group's core belief that the spirit of the Aryan race could be resurrected through ritual practice, guided meditation, and astral rites that connected participants to mythic ancestors. Federal agencies first noticed the group not because of its ideology, but because of its weapons. Reports surfaced of individuals linked to the circle purchasing firearms, explosives components, and military surplus materials in unusual quantities. Though many extremist groups operated during the era, the circle's behavior stood out. Purchases were coordinated across multiple states, suggesting an organized infrastructure. When law enforcement attempted to trace these transactions, they encountered a network of shell organizations, community halls, and nature clubs that obscured the group's structure. The FBI quietly opened a file. Early surveillance revealed gatherings near secluded cabins, where participants engaged in nighttime rituals that blended chanting with the display of prohibited symbols. Informants described long sessions in which members entered meditative trances, claiming to communicate with ancestral entities who would guide them when the time came to initiate a broader spiritual awakening. The language was mystical, but the implications were darker. Some documents seized later suggested that the circle believed violent upheaval was inevitable and that they would serve as spiritual catalysts. What investigators found particularly unsettling was the group's obsession with young recruits. Recruitment materials recovered from abandoned safe houses framed adolescence as a formative threshold where identity could be reshaped. Internal guidelines encouraged senior members to groom younger followers through mentorship, guiding them toward purification rituals meant to sever emotional ties to families and external institutions. These rituals sometimes involved isolated retreats in deep forests, where participants fasted, meditated, and performed role-playing exercises that simulated mythic battles. The goal was to erode modern identity and replace it with an idealized warrior spirit identity drawn from extremist fantasy. By the 1970s, the FBI had placed informants inside the group. Their reports revealed a hierarchy modeled loosely after the SS, including ranks determined not by combat proficiency, but by perceived spiritual depth. At the highest level stood a council known internally as the Solar Tribunal, composed of elders who claimed to interpret signs from the Black Sun. They oversaw rituals, approved new members, and coordinated interstate activities. Handwritten notes retrieved from surveillance operations mentioned plans to form cells of awakening, groups intended to operate autonomously while preserving shared doctrine. The rituals themselves remained the core of the circle's identity. One particularly disturbing practice involved animal sacrifice, conducted during solstice ceremonies. Investigators later discovered remains buried in woodland clearings, arranged in patterns consistent with symbols found in seized manuscripts. The group believed the sacrifices released etheric residue that could be channeled into astral rites. These practices, though small in scale, reinforced the group's isolation from mainstream society and its drift toward increasingly extremist mysticism. Federal intervention intensified when intercepted communications suggested that certain members were experimenting with explosives, claiming they needed to study forces of destruction as part of their spiritual training. The language was vague, but enough to justify deeper infiltration. In 1978, undercover agents successfully joined a regional cell. Their field notes described gatherings filled with fevered speeches about rebirth, purification, and a coming era when the hidden sun will rise again. While these statements were not overt calls for violence, the combination of fanaticism and access to weapons posed a clear threat. The breaking point came in the early 1980s, when evidence surfaced that the Circle had acquired illegal explosive devices. A multi-state operation was launched. During the final raid, federal agents seized stockpiles of weapons, ritual documents, uniforms bearing Black Sun sigils, and correspondence linking the group to small extremist circles abroad. Several members were arrested on charges ranging from illegal possession of explosives to conspiracy. The raids effectively dissolved the Circle's organized structure, though isolated adherents resurfaced years later. In the aftermath, analysts studying the case noted the unusual hybrid nature of the movement. It was neither a traditional hate group nor a standard occult society. Instead, it represented a convergence of myth, trauma, fantasy, and ideology, an attempt to resurrect an identity shattered by history. Interviews with former members revealed that many were drawn not by hatred, but by a longing for belonging and transcendence. The rituals offered them a sense of purpose. The mythology gave them a narrative in which they played a central role. The remnants of the Black Sun Resurrection Circle survive only in fragments, scattered online writings, photocopied manuscripts, declassified reports, and half-abandoned rumors within extremist echo chambers. To historians, it stands as a reminder of how dangerous myths can become when combined with isolation, secrecy, and the promise of spiritual rebirth. To investigators, it symbolizes a rare fusion of occult ritual and extremist ideology, a movement that sought not political power but metaphysical resurrection, believing that beneath the surface of the modern world lay a dormant force waiting to be awakened through firelight, chanting, and the symbol of a sun that never truly rose. The movement that would later be called the Children of the Light experiment began not with a prophecy, nor with an apocalyptic warning, but with an idea, subtle, deceptively gentle, and more dangerous than any doomsday sermon. It emerged in Colorado during the 1970s, rooted in the conviction of one man, Harold Broussard, who believed children entered the world carrying an untouched spiritual frequency that adults had lost. To him, every child was a potential vessel for extraordinary psychic abilities. It was the world, he claimed, that corrupted them, and only isolation could preserve their purity long enough for their supposed powers to be awakened. Broussard did not present himself as a prophet in the beginning. He spoke softly, dressed plainly, and carried an air of calm that drew in parents searching for alternatives to the increasingly chaotic culture of the era. His message appealed to those disillusioned with traditional institutions, schools that felt rigid, religions that felt hollow, and social systems that seemed to produce conformity rather than enlightenment. He offered something radically different, a promise that their children could transcend ordinary limitations. The early gatherings resembled alternative education workshops. Parents brought their children to remote cabins outside Colorado Springs, where Broussard taught breathing exercises, silent reflection practices, and what he called mind-link games. The children sat in circles, hands on their knees, eyes closed, encouraged to sense the thoughts of those around them. Parents watched with fascination as Broussard spoke of unlocking dormant potential, suggesting that the children could one day communicate telepathically, heal emotional wounds, and guide humanity toward a more harmonious future. By the late 1970s, the community had expanded into a secluded compound. Cabins multiplied, a central hall was constructed, and boundaries were established to keep outsiders away. Within those boundaries, a new reality formed. Silence dominated daily life. Children were instructed to observe long periods without speaking, sometimes lasting hours or even full days. Broussard taught that language was a barrier, a human invention that limited psychic perception. Without words, he claimed, the children could listen to the world more clearly. The shift from unconventional education to cultic structure happened gradually. As families spent more time on the property, Broussard's teachings grew increasingly rigid. He began speaking of contaminating influences that could sever a child's spiritual connection: television, public schools, peers, even extended family. He insisted that outside voices disrupted the children's emerging abilities. Parents who questioned these claims were gently but firmly warned that skepticism itself could sabotage their children's progress. Testimonies collected years later described the children moving through the compound like shadows, quiet, obedient, and watchful. Some engaged in synchronized meditation sessions where Broussard walked slowly between them, touching their shoulders or placing his palms on their foreheads. These gestures were framed as energy transfers, rituals meant to guide the children into deeper states of awareness. But to former members, the silence became oppressive. They spoke of feeling suspended in a world where individual thought seemed forbidden, replaced by an overwhelming pressure to participate in a shared psychic vision. Isolation deepened. Children slept in communal rooms, where whispered conversations were discouraged. Physical contact with the outside world, friends, relatives, teachers, was severed. Letters from extended family went unanswered. Birthdays and holidays disappeared, replaced by rituals centered on silence, meditation, and obedience. The compound became a closed ecosystem of belief, with Broussard positioned at the center as the interpreter of the children's psychic evolution. The telepathy drills became the heart of the doctrine. Children sat opposite one another, while adults monitored their expressions, searching for signs of connection. If a child hesitated or expressed confusion, instructors interpreted it as resistance. Some drills lasted until the children trembled from exhaustion. Journals recovered during later investigations revealed adults documenting these sessions meticulously, assigning numerical values to each child's supposed progress. The community grew obsessed with identifying those who showed promise, creating a hierarchy among the young participants. Concerns began surfacing in nearby towns. Relatives reported losing contact with children they once saw regularly. Teachers wondered why certain students had withdrawn from school abruptly. These small alarms accumulated over several years until missing child reports finally triggered formal attention. Local authorities attempted to visit the compound, but were met with closed gates and polite refusals. Members insisted the children were safe, thriving, and protected from harmful outside influences. A turning point came when a family managed to retrieve one of their children after escaping the compound. The child, thin and withdrawn, spoke in short, halting sentences, as though language were a skill being relearned. Psychologists who evaluated the child noted signs of emotional deprivation and social interference. Their report, shared with federal investigators, strengthened the case for intervention. In the early 1990s, coordinated action was planned. Law enforcement officers approached the compound under federal authority, facing a community that responded not with violence, but with a chilling calm. Adults stood in silence as agents entered the property. Some held hands, others closed their eyes, as though retreating inward. The children, gathered in the central hall, sat motionless on the floor, watching without expression. The FBI became involved after multiple reports aligned: children removed from public visibility, parents unable to reach them, and rumors of prolonged isolation. Agents began gathering information discreetly, interviewing former members who had managed to leave the community. Their accounts painted a troubling picture of psychological control, coerced silence, and indoctrination disguised as spiritual training. Several former members described moments when children cried during meditation drills, only to be told the tears meant they were shedding old consciousness. The investigation identified multiple minors who had been kept isolated from formal education and normal social development. Custody battles ensued, with several parents claiming they had been manipulated into relinquishing decision-making authority. Some adults faced charges related to neglect and unlawful confinement. Broussard himself was detained and questioned extensively, though he denied any wrongdoing, insisting he had merely guided children towards spiritual growth. Search teams discovered notebooks filled with detailed accounts of the telepathy drills, schedules outlining mandatory silence practices, and written rules forbidding contact with outsiders. Dormitory rooms revealed bunks arranged with identical precision, personal belongings minimized to maintain uniformity. A storage room contained stacks of meditation mats and binders, describing the hierarchy of psychic purity within the child group. The community dissolved quickly after the intervention. Many members left the state, while others attempted to form smaller circles of practice that never achieved the cohesion of the original group. The children rescued from the compound faced years of therapy. Some struggled with anxiety, triggered by ordinary conversation or ambient noise, having been conditioned to associate silence with safety and spiritual identity. Others battled conflicting memories, moments of perceived connection intertwined with fear, confusion, and obedience. What remained after the compound emptied were fragments, scattered buildings reclaimed by weather, notebooks stored in evidence rooms, and the lingering question of how easily the promise of extraordinary potential can be twisted into a system that isolates, restricts, and reshapes the minds of those too young to resist. The legacy of the cult endures not in prophecy or power, but in the lives of the children who emerged from the silence, carrying whispers of a world built around the belief that they were destined to save humanity, if only they surrendered their voices first. Scholars who studied the case later concluded that the Children of the Light experiment represented one of the most unusual intersections of alternative education, spiritual extremism, and psychological conditioning in modern history. It lacked the overt violence of more infamous cults, yet its impact was profound. The group weaponized silence, transforming it from a tool of reflection into a method of control. It elevated children as sacred vessels, while simultaneously stripping them of autonomy, and in its pursuit of psychic purity, it built an environment where innocence became a resource to be shaped, measured, and ultimately exploited.